Hi, welcome back to Tiny Garage Fabrication. In today's episode, we continue work on the 1972 Datsun 620. Today we're going to remove all of the factory front suspension. We're going to do a little bit of frame surgery, going to cut the upper control arm mounts off of this frame and weld in the 720 upper control arm mounts. And that will allow us to properly hang the 720 suspension and keep its geometry right. Let's turn to. We'll begin by pulling the hub off of the driver's side. Take the castle nut off and this cotter pin. Take the spindle nut off the hub. This thing had pretty nice new bearings in it with some grease. And now I'm going to take off the caliper adapter bracket. Turns out this is a kit made by a guy who calls himself Bibani. Some penetrating fluid, so we can get back to this in a little bit. Now I'm going to remove the tension rods, and I want to make sure that I don't make the same mistake I made on the 720 frame, if you remember that from the last video, where I had to come back and remount the lower control arm. So I'm being proactive this time and taking it apart while it's still attached to the lower control arm. This way I don't feel like a dum-dum. These tension rods put up a little bit of a fight. They weren't too terrible to take off, but all of the bushings were wrecked. A lot of the nuts were fairly corroded, and it just took a little bit of time, but enough penetrating oil and enough patience, and I got through them. Now I'll move on to the driver's side. Same thing, take off the cotter pin and the castle nut. Now this spindle nut was on only finger tight, so nobody took the time to put it on correctly. Once more, the caliper bracket will come off. And I forgot my tie rod separator, so a little bit of kung fu. Awesome, that's how I do things. Now these upper control arm bushings, just completely shot. You can look at all that travel. Just one more of those things, you know. Things get rebuilt, things get passed over. I'm really glad I'm taking this suspension out because I didn't want to be driving around on that. Next up comes these shocks as well. These things, just free play. I was able to go in and out by hand, fully compressed to fully extended. The shocks were just completely knackered. Now this here shows the kingpin. It travels easy with a little bit of slop, but then it takes a lot of force to move. So there's the slop and force to move. So this thing was, who knows, maybe 1,000 miles from seizing up. I'm not sure. Looked like a recent rebuild, but turns out it was pretty trashed. Now onto the passenger side, do the same thing. Shock mount comes out. Take off the upper control arm bolts from the inside in the engine bay area. The whole upper control arm comes off, and we'll get to the lowers here in just a moment. Oh yeah, don't forget to whack yourself in the knee with the spindle, because that's always good. These upper control arm bushings were also pretty knackered, so good thing I'm getting rid of them. However, the kingpin for this spindle did seem pretty tight, so you know there's at least a small silver lining somewhere in this front suspension. I've already removed the torsion bars in this shot, and they came out the same way they did on the 720 from last video. And now I just go ahead and pull these bolts out. Don't worry about me hammering on them, I will not be reusing them because the 720 actually needs a longer bolt. Right, so here's a look at the differences between the ball joint suspension and the kingpin suspension. This here is the kingpin. See how just this part of the spindle rotates right here? Well, that's because it rides on one big pin right inside here. So it's held in place with a pin. It keeps it from sliding in and out, as well as being retained by a bolt in the bottom. It's greasable, and there's some other tension adjustments on it. And then there's also another kingpin on the bottom here, as well as, I believe there's supposed to be one on the top, but this truck had rubber bushings, and this one, well, this one's just gone. Here's the other side. You can see it's got some rubber bushings in place. But that's what I took out, and the reason why is because on this part here, they don't make one where this is, 2 inches higher, or 2 inches or more. Plus, they're kind of a pain in the butt to rebuild. The kingpins themselves are expensive and getting hard to find, and so I wanted to switch to just a conventional solid spindle. So here's the lower control arm from the 720. Now I've got the rear holes in roughly the same place, and as you come out here, this here is where the ball joint comes up. So you can see the arm is a little bit longer, which is fine. I've got a good reason for that. And then this would go onto a ball joint like this, and it turns on the ball joints. So that's able to be one solid piece. Now I do have drop spindles. They're still in the box though, but basically it just takes this section. So these points stay the same, but it moves the spindle up just 2 inches. And what that does is let your suspension stay where it is, but it effectively moves your wheel up into the body in relation to everything else. So you keep the same suspension geometry, but the truck is 2 inches lower. Pretty cool. And here's the upper control arms. You can see they're kind of roughly about the same pivot point, and they're nearly the same length. The 720 is just a tiny bit longer, which is good because the lower is also longer. When I get to welding the mounts, you'll see that the mount for the 720 kind of angles out a little bit more than this one did, which will help kind of align this to keep the spindle where it needs to be. So, outdated, old trash, newer style, not outdated trash. Now let's scrape off a couple decades worth of crud. I'll show you a very brief comparison of the 720 towers to the 620 towers. Looks like I don't know how they go, but turns out I'll actually put them on the correct way. Surprise, surprise. Now it's time to cut out the 620 control arm towers and grind everything smooth and get it prepped for welding. So here it is. Enjoy the montage. Now we'll quickly get the frame level. I'm going to go ahead and find a reference point, lower it down past 0, bring it back to 0, and then we can use the plumb bob and the pipe trick again just to verify that center line is where it needs to be. I've got these things clamped on with a couple of big C-clamps as well as some quick clamps. And then a little bit of adjust, so I'll loosen the clamps, hammer it over, loosen the clamps, hammer it over. Now I have to go back and forth from side to side because if you move one side, you move the other. I noticed there was a little bit of weld slag in those holes, so I had to get my Dremel and clear that out real quick just to make sure I was dead center on everything. Looks good. Now, let's get to welding. Buzz, buzz. Here it is. Enjoy. Now, due to the frame pieces being a little bit different from the 720 to the 620, I needed to make a couple little spacers to fill in the gap up front. So a quick piece of 1/4 inch bar stock, and I ground a little taper on it. Go ahead and whack it in underneath there, and now that should be able to be welded in solid, and I'll have a good, secure mount all the way around. And there they are, they're all welded in. Not the prettiest welds. I normally don't grind my welds, but I did on these, and that's just a fact of the weld through primer. I can never get a good weld with that stuff. It contaminates everything, but it's important to use. So what are you gonna do? I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Got a lot of work done, still a whole lot of work to do, but the most important thing that I needed to do was get those upper control mounts swapped over. Next episode, we will dry fit the 720 suspension components, as well as swap in one more major piece for the suspension that needs to be swapped over, and then we'll get on to making everything look really good. So I started doing something new. Down in the description, I added links to some of the tools and materials that I use in these videos, so check those out. It will really help my channel out a lot, and what would help me even more is if you hit that subscribe button, left some comments, and smash that like button. So stay tuned for the next episode. Thanks, everybody.